Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. Welcome to the David Attenborough Building. This is the culmination of another extraordinary week in the life of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. We've had over 20 people from all the finalists in the Endangered Landscapes programme that's been launched this year here, mixing, mingling, learning, sharing, working out how to do log frames together and plan the most extraordinary set of landscape restoration programs across Europe. We're very lucky that many of the participants have stayed with us for this evening, and we're even luckier to have somebody who has played an absolutely crucial part in creating and developing this whole Endangered Landscapes programme for us here to speak tonight. He doesn't really need any introduction, but I'm afraid he's going to get one. Sir John Lawton, of course, is known to be a world-renowned ecologist, naturalist, environmental scientist, birder, and probably wants to be known most for being a Yorkshireman. He has had a long and distinguished academic career in Durham, Oxford, York and Imperial College. He ran the Natural Environment Research Council in this country and was the last chair of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution before the government very stupidly wound up such a commission. But he then went on to publish or produce and lead a process that created something that's changed the face of nature conservation in the UK and probably internationally, a report called Making Space for Nature. He's not just going to talk about that, he tells us he's got a completely new talk, but on that subject you can see here. We know and love him most in CCI because he has been generous enough to chair the Oversight and Selection Panel for the Endangered Landscapes programme, and having been privileged enough to be as part of that group as an observer listening in, John made that process highly rigorous, highly informative, highly entertaining and great fun. So John, thank you very much for coming, and we're really looking forward to this talk. John.
Thank you, Mike. I'm actually from Lancashire.
Oh. Well, I blew that, didn't I?
This is about nature conservation in Britain, and it's about the history of nature conservation in Britain. And it really starts with about 100 years ago. You can see the timelines of the things I'm going to talk about. So the top timeline, which is ongoing, is the establishment of protected areas of good habitat, the traditional nature reserve. Round about 1950 in the UK, there was deliberate habitat creation within existing reserves. Deliberate habitat creation and recreation outside existing reserves didn't really get underway until the late 1985 and the 1990s, and that's clearly going on. And then the big new thing, of course, is rewilding. The exact dates on which those different processes and different stages of conservation in the UK are difficult to define and pin down because the phases are fuzzy and so on. And I'm just going to talk about terrestrial and freshwater habitats because the marine environment, important as it is round the coast of the UK, is just a step too far, as is talking about a similar set of processes on the continent of Europe, because first, I've only got 55 minutes, and second, I just don't know about large parts of Europe, shaming as that is. So that's basically the plan of the talk. Now, nature conservation in the UK, in any kind of modern guise, there was clearly nature conservation going way back to the Normans, provided you could hunt it and eat it. But for nature conservation in the form as we know it, really started with this quite remarkable man, the Honourable Nathaniel Charles Rothschild. He was an entomologist, he was a visionary, and he happened to be fabulously wealthy because he was part of the Rothschild family. And in May 1912, he convened a meeting at the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, with 3 friends to formulate the first formal national plan, that's the UK, excluding Ireland, for conservation in the UK. And his genius was to realise that not only did individual species need protection, which was ongoing at the time, you know, providing mainly you could hunt it and eat it, but other species were being protected, but habitats needed to be conserved. That was Rothschild. It seems blindingly obvious now, but at the time, in the early 1900s, that was a major insight. There was a leader in the Times, and again for our overseas visitors, you know, the Times was the place to put major political statements in a newspaper, and for some people it still is. And that was in 1912, and we largely think that the editor of the Times at the time allowed Rothschild to write it. And what he said was, in laying out the plan for nature conservation, that there's a need to preserve, and this is lovely, they don't write English like this anymore, the tracts and nooks of land that represent the last relics of unspoilt nature, replete with their old native flora and fauna. In other words, places that are bloody good for birds. And other things. And to that end, the outcome of the May 1912 meeting was to establish the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves, whose objective was to identify the best sites in Britain and Ireland for wildlife, to promote their protection by lobbying and persuasion, not by ownership. They would be owned by the National Trust, which was a body that, again, we were out today, the major National Trust property, of which I'll say more later. But they were to be owned by the National Trust. And Rothschild and his 3 colleagues worked very quickly. By the early months of 1913, they had a preliminary list of sites, and by 1915, he'd identified 284 sites, 182 of them in England, worthy of preservation. The so-called, now we refer to them as the Rothschild reserves. They're a pretty idiosyncratic and sometimes quite eclectic set of sites. Some of the really important sites that existed at the time weren't on the list, and some of the ones that were on the list, one wonders why. But ultimately, the identification of the Rothschilds reserves was again a stroke of genius and paved the way for the preservation by the establishment of nature reserves in the United Kingdom for roughly the next 100 years. And the aim in this process was to preserve remnants of surviving habitat. So you took a remnant of surviving habitat and you preserved it. You essentially put a fence around it and called it a nature reserve, and sometimes you literally put a fence around it and called it a nature reserve, and you kept people out. Only you had to get permits to go into most of these places, so the idea of inclusion again was a pretty alien concept at the time. So it's not possible really to say with, again, great precision when the first nature reserves preserves were established in the UK, because their acquisition was frequently spread over several years, but 2 in particular are amongst, if not the oldest. Wickham Fen was purchased by the National Trust at SPNR's request between 1915 and 1920, and that's where we were today, and that's one of the very, very first places I visited as a young naturalist, and I've rephotographed the windmill today. I was there in round about 1960, I think it was about 1962, when I also went to the other site in the fens here, Rothschilds, the Wood Walton fen, which Rothschild had purchased in 1910 and gave it to SPNR in 1919, and they were amongst, if not the first 2 recognisable nature reserves in Britain. They've since got bigger and so on, but that was the start. And Wood Walton fen and Wickham fen both still exist, and over the last 100 years, one of the really terrifying things is that many of the sites identified by Rothschild have been destroyed. Now these were the cathedrals of nature conservation. They were the amongst the best remaining sites in Britain. And can you imagine the uproar there would be if we decided that a quarter of all our medieval cathedrals were dispensable? Didn't need them. you know, knock them down. You can keep the plans and build a supermarket on it instead. I mean, it's outrageous of what we've done. So, in 1997, when this book summarised what had happened to Rothschild's reserves, of the 182 English sites worthy of preservation, 19, 10% were still essentially intact. Only 10% were still essentially intact. 84, nearly half, still had more than half their area, but had lost quite substantial areas. A third survived as tiny remnants. More than half the habitat had been destroyed, and just over 10% had been totally destroyed. I mean, imagine destroying 10% of the medieval cathedrals in a country. That's how much we didn't care about nature conservation. It's depressing. So, some of these figures will be familiar to many of you, and but we have other people in the audience for which they may not be. So 97% of the species-rich grasslands, hay meadows, have been destroyed since the end of the Second World War. Only tiny remnants of some habitats survive. This is Askham Bog, which is a site close to where I live in York. And this particular habitat, where at the end of the glaciation, there were thousands of square kilometres of it in England. Only 10 square kilometres survive in total across the whole of England. And heathland, which is a very special northwest European habitat, largely anthropogenically created on thin soils that originally had birch and pine wood on. 80% of the lowland heaths in England have disappeared since 1800, and most of that happened since 1950. As you'll see later, habitat management and recreation is restoring some of that and some of the other habitats as well. But these are the measures of the scale of the losses ongoing since Rothschild produced his report. And these are net losses, remember. From Rothschild onwards, the conservation movement has continued to add to the nation's stock of nature reserves. So we've continued to add, and we started off with 2 or 3, and now there are hundreds of them. The voluntary sector owns or manages reserves by the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, etc., etc., etc. The statutory conservation agencies, Nature Conservancy Council, now Natural England, established national nature reserves. They designated sites of special scientific interest, many of which are the same as some of the sites owned by the voluntary sector. There's a lot of overlap. And we've kept adding to the stock of reserves. So the basic tenet of wildlife conservation, since Rothschild to roughly the beginning of, roughly in the 1980s, has been preservation, creating nature reserves on sites that remain good. Protect, look after and treasure places. And where are they and what are they? Well, as Mike said, in 2010 I chaired a panel that produced the report called Making Space for Nature, and we identified 3 kinds of sites. And interesting enough, back in 2010, this was the first attempt to produce a summary of what protected sites we had in England. That was the first time it had been done. There wasn't an inventory. The first one we called Tier 1 sites, and they're protected by statute. They're legally protected, and their primary purpose is nature conservation. They have a high level of protection through the statute and through ownership. They're sites of special scientific interest. They're SACs, SPAs, RAMSAs, NNRs. You know, the spaghetti of acronyms, and some local nature reserves. They make up about 6.9% of England's land area. Tier 2 sites are designated for their high biodiversity value, but they have not got statutory protection. They're protected by the planning system, which is a much weaker form of protection, and they include local wildlife sites and, interestingly, the ancient woodland inventory. And there's a huge debate going on in the UK at the moment about how lousy our protection of ancient woodland is, because there's a weasel word in the statutes that say we've got to look after our ancient woodland except when it's inconvenient. It's awful. The Tier 3 sites are primarily designated for other reasons, but wildlife conservation is included in their statutory purpose as a secondary purpose, and they're the areas of outstanding natural beauty and the national parks. And together they make up just a bit less than 10% of the land area. And there are quite a lot of sites throughout the UK that don't enjoy any levels of protection, even though they're interesting. Though the really good sites now mostly have some form of protection under that system. The UK is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, signed in Nagoya in 2010, and that we signed up to saying that we would agree to protect, as did all nations that signed up, which is most nations, 17% of each nation's terrestrial and freshwater habitats. Now you think, boy, 17% has got to be defined by some really precise science. No, it's a compromise between 10 and 20. A political compromise between 10 and 20. It has no basis in science whatsoever, basically. Well, it roughly has. The bigger area you protect, the more you'll get. But the accuracy is spurious. This is what they look like. So you've got the Tier 1 sites in there, in orange, which make up 6.9% of the land area. You've got the Tier 2 sites in green, which make up 6.5% of the land area. And Tier 3 sites, the national parks, and the AONBs in blue, which make up about 9.1% of the area. Now it looks on there as though a huge amount of the land in England is protected. Well, actually that's an artifact of the fact that the Tier 2 sites are often tiny little dots and you can't see them unless you paint them a bit bigger than they actually are. The national parks, AONBs and the Tier 1 sites are pretty accurately represented, and you can see why I live in the north of England. You can't then just add those numbers up and say that is the level of the amount of land that's protected, because there's quite a lot of double counting in there. So, for example, the double 23.5% of the national parks are also sites of special scientific interest. So there's quite a lot of double counting, and we don't know what the real area is. Nobody's ever worked it out. There's a nice master's project there for somebody to do. It's definitely more than 10%, but probably less than 17%. But we don't know. Isn't that interesting? Well, I think it's interesting. And it's clearly not enough. However big it is, it's clearly not enough. Because the State of Nature report that came, the second State of Nature report that came out in 2016, which is the most up-to-date evaluation of UK wildlife, shows that 56% of UK species assessed in the report have declined over the last 50 years. So over half of all the species that have declined, and it's a big sample, have declined over the last 50 years. A third of those have declined strongly. Invertebrates are declining much faster than other animals. I suspect that has something to do with neonicotinoids, but we'll not go there. Range sizes are contracting, and the number of site species occur on are falling. Plants are the taxonomic group with the greatest threat, with about 19% of all UK plant species threatened with extinction. Nearly 20% of all our native plant species are threatened with extinction. And 213 species that are designated of special conservation concern have declined by 67% over the last 50 years. It's a lousy record. It's a lousy record. And in fact, the UK has lost significantly more nature in the long term than the global average. So we pride ourselves in loving nature, and yet we have lost more nature. We rank 189th from 218 countries for the level at which we've destroyed our nature. So government rhetoric and other rhetoric about how much we love nature is simply fundamentally flawed. Why is it happening? I mean, well, first of all, let me say, so that's not a great record. We've been building all these nature reserves, got all these designations, got all these protected areas, and yet it's not enough. So Rothschild was a waste of time, and nature reserves are a waste of time. Absolutely not. Think how much worse it would have been without all those protected areas. I mean, it would have been catastrophic without the protected areas. So it isn't as though they're a waste of time. Why has it happened? Well, it's happened because of some very simple things: the industrialisation, the urbanisation, and the pollution of quite big areas of the country, but most of all because of agricultural intensification. If you've been out on the fens today, for those of you who've not seen it before, it's an agri-desert out there, most places. And it's interesting to sort of have this is just a sort of cartoon summary of what actually happened. So between 1870 and 1940, which is the period roughly two-thirds of the way through Rothschild's life, Rothschild died in 1923. Actually, he committed suicide. which is a terrible tragedy for in those, because he was funding a lot of nature conservation in Britain. But during Rothschild's life, the world looked roughly like this diagram. The pale green area is a benign agricultural matrix. It was a benign agricultural matrix because between about 1870 and the Second World War, UK agriculture was in serious trouble. It was profoundly depressed, the agricultural depression, and there was the abandonment of very large areas of rough grazing, marginal land, and so on. The agricultural workforce during that period declined by nearly a half. And there was lots of uncultivated land and what I like to call with messy edges. Messy edges. So Rothschild was interested in conserving the remnants of nature identified by Rothschild, and they're the dark green areas, but the matrix round it, we would have thought it was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And then there were also areas in the agricultural matrix that are grey there, they were just patches of unfarmed land, wet plodgy bits and so on. So it was and Rothschild's world was really quite different to the one we are now familiar with, and it was a benign world for nature. Go forward to the period after the Second World War, between 1950 and 1970, and Ian Newton, who, if you haven't read it, his wonderful new naturalist book on farming and wildlife, Ian refers to this period between 1950 and 1970 as the post-war farming revolution, and he called it the mechanisation and the chemicalisation of agriculture. So the matrix is becoming increasingly hostile to nature. The farming matrix is becoming increasingly hostile through mechanisation and chemicalisation. Surviving patches of habitat are beginning to get some protection. There's a new RSPB reserve there on the left. Some of the sites identified by Rothschild are now protected, but they're smaller. Many of them have been reduced in size. So we're getting a less benign matrix, and the protected sites themselves are smaller than they were when Rothschild was alive in many cases. Go forward again to 2000, and much of the agricultural matrix is now extremely hostile to wildlife. But most of the sites that have some residual nature conservation or are important for nature conservation now agree some level of protection. So paradoxically, although the number of protected sites has increased dramatically from 2, Wood Walton Fen and Wickham Fen when Rothschild was first establishing them, to hundreds by 2000. The number of protected sites has increased dramatically. The land available for nature has decreased, and habitats have become more isolated. So that we've made less space for nature, not more. A hell of a lot less space for nature, not more. And inevitably, the species that used to live in the matrix and depending on connections between the landscape have been lost. That's why we're in the situation we're in. And you can't illustrate that any better, for example, than the decline in formerly what are called common farmland birds. You can see the intensification of the chemicalisation of agriculture in the little illustrations. But many birds of farmland that were formerly common and widespread specialist species have suffered a pretty catastrophic decline, and many of them continue to decline because the agricultural matrix is a heck of a lot less benign than it used to be. That began people thinking and saying, well, maybe we could do something about that. Now, the thing that I find puzzling is why the move to restore nature, the move to rather than simply preserve it, but restore and recreate habitat, took so long to dawn on people. It's very odd, because we knew you could do it accidentally. So the picture on the left here is Leyton Moss. That's in northwest Lancashire. That was where I cut my teenage teeth as a birder, and I thought everybody had a place like this on their doorstep. And in that year, I found, with colleagues, wading into the reed beds with plimsolls on the shores, we found a bitterns nest. The first bitterns breeding in northwest England for 100 years. That was farmland. It was drained and reclaimed for agriculture in 1822. And it was potato fields. But it was abandoned in 1918 during the First World War because they could no longer keep the pumps running. And so it flooded. And the subsequent habitat restoration happened completely accidentally. But why didn't people learn about that? Why did it take so long to figure out, yeah, we can make wetlands, it's not difficult, just flood it and leave it? The fascinating thing is, on Wharton Crag there, behind there, there were red deer surviving in the forest, and red deer are basically a wetland deer. We tend to think of them on Scottish hillsides, you know, freezing cold, and they're scraggy beasts, and they're half the size of these beasts. Red deer are basically a wetland deer for part of the year, and they're a great addition to the landscape, and they thrive in Leighton moss. So there's an example that we didn't learn from. The even more famous Minsbere Reserve in Suffolk was initially created in 1940. Farmland was deliberately flooded as a wartime defence, and in the Second World War, and that was actually done for a completely other reason, and it quickly turned into a wonderful wetland. The first serious warden when RSPB took it over in the 60s was a guy called Bert Axel, and he began to do habitat recreation inside Minsmere, not outside. So he made the famous scrape at Minsmere by literally scraping the ground out and creating lagoons. But Axel, again, it's hard to figure this out, why this took so long, but Axel was the first person to say, oh, we can make more habitat if we do it deliberately, but that was inside the reserve, not outside. But gradually, the conservation moved not from just preservation now to the restoration of sites, both internally and externally. That began to develop slowly, and it's difficult to say when the first deliberate habitat restoration, recreation projects outside reserves began to take place. But by the mid-1990s, we can identify a growing number of sites where habitat was being restored and recreated. Amongst the first, and this is a measure, it's an anecdotal, but the first RSPB project that was to completely recreate a completely new habitat, I think, was Lake and Heath Fen in Suffolk, when I was chairman of the council and Barbara Young was chief executive. So the idea was you buy some carrot fields, and then you flood them and turn them into a wetland. I had a hell of a problem with about a third of the board of RSPB who thought we were mad to buy carrot fields. Absolutely bonkers, because you just didn't do that. It had no bird interest whatsoever. Except it's now a fantastic fen, 3 square kilometres of woodland. It was made possible by Heritage Lottery Fund money, of which more in a minute, and now Lake and Heath has breeding cranes and it's 3 square kilometre wetland, and it's part of this growing complex of wetlands that are being created in East Anglia and East Norfolk, across and you know, round here in the fens, a growing number of sites being recreated. But it's really puzzling that it took until, let's say, 1990 before people really twigged that you could do this, even though we could see it happening accidentally. I don't understand that. There's a nice PhD project there for somebody. So there's then a phase, including in the period of Lake and Heath Fen and others, where a major funder now of this kind of work, called the Heritage Lottery Fund, which distributes money of the National Lottery for all kinds of heritage projects, including wildlife conservation. And the real change, I think, came when the Heritage Lottery Fund visionarily decided to establish what they call the Landscape Partnership Programme in 1994. And that essentially kick-started really large-scale habitat restoration and recreation about 1994. And I say Lake and Heath Fen would not have been possible without Heritage Lottery Fund money. The focus there was big scale. It was between 20 and 200 square kilometres, with an initial investment from HLF of 22.3 million quid. So you know it was a big investment, and a specific additional programme was called Tomorrow's Heathland Heritage, which ran from 1997 to 2001. The Tomorrow's Heathland Heritage sites are shown on there, that recreated over 2,000 hectares of heathland, completely restored and recreated 2,300 hectares of heathland. So it turned around that loss of heathland that had been going on since for at least 100 years. And 1998 specifically was a major turning point. Prior to that, the Heritage Lottery Fund money wasn't strategic, and it wasn't part of their strategic plan. It just sort of happened. The application for Lakenheath to them, for example, was just a one-off. They weren't expecting that kind of. We said this is heritage, it's wildlife. Wildlife is part of our heritage. Think skylarks and the trouts and all that kind of stuff. But in 1998, the board of Heritage Lottery Fund decided to make land acquisition for nature conservation and land and habitat recreation an explicit part of their strategy. And a paper that was written for the board said, in the future, HLF will give funding priority to habitat restoration and repair, guided by the UK Biodiversity Action Plan. Species programs will have a lower priority unless they involve elements of habitat repair and restoration. And that became HLF policy, and I think that's the first formal recognition in any body that although it had been going on formally, that this was part of their national strategy. So the aim was to turn that into something like that, or a wetland, or what have you. It's for the National Farmers Union, of course, that's sacrilege. So between 1994 and 2017, when the scheme was last year, and when the scheme was closed for new bids, these are the landscape level partnership schemes, which are red. They're all the landscape level partnership schemes that HLF funded, and the size of the dot in red is not the size of the area, it's the amount of money that they received. But each one got many millions, and it's roughly proportional to the size of the area. The green areas are other nature conservation projects they did, but they were not predominantly habitat recreation. There was, but halfway through this period, the government of the day, which was a Labour government at the time, suddenly realised that they were being left behind, that there was a big movement going on in the conservation movement, which government had played essentially no part in. And in 2009, the then Secretary of State, a man called Hilary Benn, who was a lovely guy, asked me to chair a review, it came out as Making Space for Nature, and to report back to the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the government in general on the state of nature in England and why all this habitat recreation was necessary. And the Making Space for Nature report, which came out in 2010, concluded on rigorous evidence that most protected sites were too small. 77% of SSIs and 98% of local wildlife sites were smaller than 100 hectares. They just weren't very big. The losses of certain habitats, as we've seen, were just so much that there was hardly any left at all, with the exception of Natura 2000 sites and SSS and some SSSIs. Most sites were in pretty ropey condition, and many of the natural connections in the countryside have been lost. And the report was fairly was hard hitting about that. In the meantime, when in between being asked to write the report by Hilary Benn and producing the report, the government changed. We got a coalition government of the Conservatives and the Labour Party, but the new Secretary of State for the Environment, Caroline Spellman, to her eternal credit, agreed to continue to accept the report and to accept its recommendations. And Caroline she gets very little recognition for that, but it was a brave thing to do, confronted by a Prime Minister who basically didn't care about the environment. And of the 24 recommendations, one was to establish 12 nature improvement areas, which were sites where we were going to put nature back into the landscape. Some of you have heard this story. When I first went to see Caroline Spellman, the idea was we'd run a national competition to establish nature improvement areas, and it would be a competition, and then we would select 12 winners, and then they would be funded to put nature back into their landscapes. And Caroline looked at me and said, you know, John, the problem is, if there's a competition, there'll be losers. And I looked her in the eye and said, coming from a Conservative minister, that's rich. And her face froze, and I thought, bugger, I've blown it. And then she laughed. I said, we'll do it. We'll do it. And so the guiding mantra was more, bigger, better and joined. We want more designations and new sites. We want bigger sites. We want better managed sites. And we want joined sites. And that's where more, bigger, better and joined came from. It wasn't my wording. We were sitting around the table when we more or less got the report, and we decided we need a strap line so so you could explain it to a minister who was not very bright. And it was Tom Chew who was on the panel. Tom sat there and went all misty-eyed and said, more, bigger, better and joined. And that was it. I wish I'd thought of it, but it wasn't. It was Tom. And that mantra has now somehow entered the psyche of conservationists in Britain and now in Europe. These are the 12 nature improvement areas that eventually won. I remember when Caroline agreed that we could have the competition, I thought, what happens if nobody applies? Supposing that nobody bothers to put a nature improvement area in. Remember, these are consortia of the willing. They're nobody was going to impose a nature improvement area on anybody. The local conservation bodies, local businesses, local landowners, the statutory agencies that control our rivers and our waters and our reservoirs had to come together in consortia of the willing to build a nature improvement area. Well, I needn't have worried. We had 76 bids from all over the country. In fact, this is England. 76 bids, which is a measure, again, of how much people actually, individual people and organisations care about nature conservation. Don't anybody tell you people in this country don't care. It's governments and business that doesn't care, by and large. There are 12 of them, and they're there. They're very different. So one of them is an entirely urban nature improvement area, Birmingham and the Black Country, putting nature back into a deeply urban landscape. Some of it is upland peat restoration, as in the Dark Peak. Some of them are post-industrial landscapes, is the Durham Valley in Yorkshire, the Greater Thames Marshes, and so on and so forth. So they're a very mixed bag. One of the things that I really hoped would take off, this one, is the South Downs Way nature improvement area, and those are sites strung like pearls along a string along a long distance footpath. Wouldn't it be marvellous to have the equivalent of nature improvement areas along all our long distance footpaths, either side of the track? It'd be great. It hasn't happened yet, but I keep plugging it. It will one day. And this is just an example. This is the Humberhead Levels nature improvement area. It happens to be mainly in Yorkshire. It happened to be mainly run and developed by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. At the time I was chairman of their board, so I had nothing to do with this. I had to leave the room when this one was being discussed. And it's based on two sites, this one and this one, which are old abandoned peat workings with some residual lowland fen involved. And the rest of it is fairly intense agricultural land. But all the things in colour on there are changes, putting nature back in, that are agreed by the local landowners. They wanted to do this. And now we have 2, possibly 4 pairs of breeding cranes on here, which it is great. And I remember talking to a farmer from down here about why he wanted to put little ponds in the edge of his fields. And this is honestly true. He said, it's bloody boring. And it is, if you think about it. He's sitting in a tractor, harrowing this big flat field, and he said and he loved seeing when the cranes bred. They took the chicks onto the adjacent farmland, and he wanted to see crane chicks on his land because it made his job and life more interesting. Great. So and then they're very different. Wild Purbeck down in Dorset is restored heathland. Greater Thames Marshes, right on the edge of some heavily built up, heavily polluted areas on the Thames Marshes. Fabulous place. The Meres and Mosses of the Marches, a series of wetlands in Cheshire and Shropshire, and the Marlborough Downs, which was an entirely farmer-led operation. These are big-scale arable farmers on the downland. It's also, incidentally, the best place in Britain for getting evidence of flying saucers, which is what this is, crop cirtle, and entirely farmland, and so on. So they overall they basically what the nature improvement areas are only about 5% of each nature improvement area has been made more, bigger, better and joined through habitat restoration and recreation. Only 5% of the area of each one. The total area within each that is valuable for nature is quite a lot bigger than 5%, but we don't know by how much. There's no central inventory of that because some of them, they all had sites that were worthy of conservation anyway. And the total area of land put back back for nature across all the 12 sites is only 25 square kilometres. So it's not big scale stuff. But the really important thing is it was voluntary, consortium of the willing, doing it on land that they had control over. So it's classical land sharing. You've got a working landscape with farms and so on, in which you try and put nature back voluntarily by the people who can control it. So what we're doing, and this is a version that some of you will have seen on the slide. Each of those spots is a protected area. The size of that protected area is along the bottom, so you've got, this is 1 hectare, 10 square kilometres, 100 square kilometres, and so on along the bottom. And the management intensity that you have to do to keep those habitats in some sort of decent shape is on an arbitrary scale going upwards. But we know that the amount of effort you have to put into managing land for nature conservation gets more and more intense the smaller and smaller the area, per unit area or habitat. So what we're now trying to do, what nature conservation is now trying to do, is move in this direction. That's the direction we're trying to go. So these are the sort of traditional Rothschild reserves at this end, and then you get some bigger areas. I'll show you what some of these are later on. What we're trying to do is to restore more and more natural ecosystem processes at larger and larger scales in a landscape as we move in this direction. And that's actually what's happening in the UK and other places at the moment. And there's now a lot going on. I was surprised by just how much now habitat recreation is going on. And so the more, bigger, better and join movement has really taken off. In land sharing initiatives, as well as the nature improvement areas, there is now the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust Natural England Farmer Clusters Initiative, which I'll tell a bit about in a minute. There is the National Trust Priority Habitats Initiative, of which we saw one today. The Wildlife Trust Living Landscapes Initiative, the RSPB's Futurescapes, and the UK government's new 25-year environmental plan. All those are all actually doing or talking about putting nature back into the landscape. And at the really big end, you've got rewilding initiatives that include the Knepp Estate in West Sussex, Wild Ennerdale, and now the 2 CCI endangered landscapes projects in the UK and European-wide. And then there are a whole lot of private initiatives, both private and consortia, that I don't have time to talk about. I'm not going to say anything about the RSPB, the Futurescapes, because you're in a room that knows a hell of a lot more about them than I do. But here's the Game and Wildlife Trust Natural England Farmers Cluster Initiative. It's modelled on the Marlborough Downs NIA, so this is the Marlborough Downs NIA. And again, the green areas there are all the new bits of habitat that the Wiltshire farmers put in. Again, because it made their lives more interesting. They wanted to do it, and most of that they paid for themselves. There are some really good landowners and farmers out there, believe me or not. And the idea here is, again, it's consortia of the willing. The groups of farmers come together to work together, and they decide what they want to do. There's no prescriptions. Each farmer says, I want more hares. His neighbour says, I want more partridges. And they agree what they're going to do, and then and some of them get funding to do that. But a lot of it, again, is individual landowners paying for these initiatives from their own pockets. And it's remarkable how that's grown. The Marlborough Downs NIA was taken as a model by DEFRA, and then in 2015 there were 5 clusters trialled to see how they would work. It's now grown to over 100 clusters covering 5,500 square kilometres and 1,500 individual farmers. That's a hell of an area. And it's classical land sharing again, and the alternative, of course, is land sparing. So what you could do is not try and insert nature into a working landscape, but actually just forget it and farm the hell out of the land you're going to farm. So these are agri-deserts, and that spares land for conservation, but this land is absolutely useless for nature conservation versus land sharing, which is that kind of landscape. Making space for nature said that's a seriously bad idea. For one thing, if you're going to have 2 kinds of policies for land management, land sharing, which is, which can cover everywhere, agricultural land, nature reserves, you have one lot of land use policies, if you do this, you have to have two different sets of land use policies. You have to have a land use policy for that and a land use policy for that, because this is horribly polluting, damages the soil and does all kinds of things. So you have to have two sets of land use policies. And another reason why this is a bad idea is the poor people who live in this kind of landscape become sensorily deprived from anything to do with nature. It's an awful landscape if you're interested in nature. So we said this is a bad idea. We want to try and do land sharing as much as we can until we get to really big scales. The National Trust Priority Habitats Initiative aims to do a similar thing. The stuff we saw today at the Fen, that massive habitat restoration is part of the Priority Habitats Initiative. And the National Trust want to create 250 square kilometres of habitat on trust land by 2025. That's 10% of their land holdings. In my view, they could do more, but that's pretty good. They have at least 50% of their farmland as nature friendly, and so on and so forth. So again, classical land sharing. But then again, it's a major initiative by the National Trust, of which we saw some at Wicken today. The Wildlife Trust Living Landscapes is again the same, where major amounts of land are being restored and recreated by the Wildlife Trusts. There are 47 wildlife trusts across the UK, and actually we have no central inventory of what in aggregate they're doing. We don't know, and that worries me slightly. But some of it is great. So here's the Cumbria Wildlife Trust. This is a 3 kilometre long, completely recreated wildflower meadow in Cumbria. And this is Pottery Car in Yorkshire, which is one of my local nature reserves. And that's Hunter Marsh, a completely new recreated wetland by HLF money, which is an enormous marsh, now has breeding bitterns and breeding avocets and so on. That was carrot fields, well, just ordinary fields 10 years ago. And there is the government's policy. Well, government aspirations, because in January the Prime Minister launched a Green Future, our 25-year plan to improve the environment, with the strong support of the current Secretary of State for the Environment, Michael Gove. Now, I never thought I would ever have anything good to say about Michael Gove. This is being recorded, by the way, and I shall get marched off to the gulag at the end of it. But actually, I don't know whether he believes it or not, but certainly the noises he's making are just marvellous. So that they want to establish a principle of net environmental gain, where if you have to do development, say taking 100 hectares of land for a new factory or a new road or a new housing estate, and it's valuable for nature conservation, you must do 300 hectares of compensation to make new habitat. They want to restore 75% of existing habitat to good condition. They want to create another 5,000 square kilometres of wildlife-rich habitat, in Michael Gove's own words, according to the Lawton principles, which is a bit embarrassing, but it's unusual to hear a Secretary of State use your name in those kinds of things. And to increase woodland in England. Now, if they were to work, that is a fantastic set of aspirations. The problem is that it's at the moment simply words. There's no commitment to translate any of that into law through an Environment Act. It's very unclear, at least to me, where the money's going to come from. Some or all, I think some, or only virtually all of it, I think will come by paying landowners, paying them, not subsidising them, paying them to deliver public goods, flood control, carbon storage, access for health and well-being and so on. Now, if we were to pay landowners to do that and stop just giving them money because they own land, which is the basic farm payment scheme, a lot of the farms we saw today out there in the fens would be completely unviable. If you paid them to deliver nature conservation and clean water and so on and so forth, it would transform nature conservation. Whether what Gove wants to do, whether we'll ever get to that, I don't know. It's very unclear to me which organisation will be responsible for delivery, and the timeframes are vague and non-existent. So there are problems, but boy, if we could do half of that, it would make a hell of a difference. And a prototype model, again, I'm talking about stuff that is dear to my heart. The Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is heavily involved in the thing called the Yorkshire Peak Partnership, where we're working with upland landowners throughout the Pennines to restore Blanket Bog. Which has fantastic nature conservation benefits, but it also has massive downstream benefits because it prevents the water running off the hill quickly, so that it prevents cities like Leeds from flooding. It is a massive carbon storage. It's got better quality water, etc., etc. And this is an example of that is actually happening, where we've restored 30,000 hectares of upland bog in the Pennines, predominantly in Yorkshire. So it's already happening. So basically, what we've been looking at is a continuum. Here's a graph. So this is 100% of land under cultivation and 100% of land semi-natural. What we've been doing in agriculture is to move in that direction, creating agri-deserts. And what we're trying to do in nature conservation is move in that direction with nature reserves, and then this slightly fuzzy area, what I call cultural landscapes, which are landscapes which are created really entirely by human activity, but also land sharing, where roughly 50% of the landscape may be in agriculture, 50% in natural habitats. They're fuzzy, but these are really important for nature conservation right the way through to rewilding. And rewilding is, so you can now see what we're doing. This is the same graph. Rewilding starts at about 10 square kilometres, these are our nature reserves at the top. There are already 2 sites in Britain which are being rewilded: Ennerdale in the Lake District and the Knepp Estate in West Sussex, which are on the small side. This is Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, and then very roughly these are the ELP sites. That's where you all sit. And then just to give you real aspirations, that's the Yellowstone and that's Okavango. You know, these are really big and wild, but that's where we sit in there. And rewilding is a process. I mean, for some people, George Monbiot, I'm a fan of. George is a really, you know, he's idiosyncratic and he's also very clever. Rewilding for George is a big area. You've got wolves and bears. Now, actually, I don't think about rewilding like that at all. I think of rewilding as a process. Rewilding is a process where we try to move as much as possible and as far as possible, putting nature back into the landscape, moving that arrow down from the top left to the bottom right, and it's a process which can go on and on and on until you get really big and there is the chance to have bears and wolves, possibly never in Britain, and so on. But rewilding is a process. We in the UK we've got the Knepp Estate and Wild Ennerdale, and then within the ELP, Summit to the Sea in Mid Wales and Cairngorms Connect in Scotland, and then the other wonderful ones elsewhere in Europe. This is Ennerdale in the Lake District. It's 200, the Lake District as a whole is just over 2,000 square kilometres, so Ennerdale's pretty small. It's 2% of the area, but it's only possible because the whole of the valley is owned by 3 organisations and working in partnership, and that makes it relatively straightforward. And it's just transforming the landscape. It's also, incidentally, stopping the villages downstream of the river that comes out of Ennerdale from flooding, because it holds the water back, unlike the other areas in the Lake District to the north, which are on barren hills where the water just whooshes off, floods Cockermouth and other places at vast expense. Rewilding pays, not only because it's incredibly better for nature conservation, but it stops cities and towns from flooding. And this is the Knepp Estate in West Sussex, which was the Burrell family. Charlie and Izzy, his wife, were losing money on their farm. They abandoned any farming and they've completely rewilded the estate. They put wetlands in. This is another example of red deer in a wetland, it's an amazing place, and they now make money because they run nature safaris and all kinds of things here. And anyway, they've got virtually no farming costs, and it's turning into a fantastic savannah. It's beautiful, and it's the only place in England where turtle doves and nightingales are actually increasing. Last summer I was there, and our biggest butterfly is a thing called the purple emperor, which is a cracking butterfly, and we counted over 200 purple emperors on one walk flying, and it's magic. If you and it's literally 20 kilometres from Gatwick Airport. If you can do it 20 kilometres from Gatwick Airport, you can do it anywhere if you have the will, the wit, and the wisdom. So it fills me with hope. It really does. And I'm not going to talk about that. Let me just press on and go there. Now, just to finish off, more, bigger, better, and joined, applied to just protected areas on its own is not going to be enough. Our ability to bring back the wild is powerfully influenced by three things: how tight and permeable the boundaries are for the protected area, the nature of the landscape outside the protected areas, I've said, and the attitude of the human beings that live inside the area and outside it. And the attitude of the people who live there is actually also fundamental. And just to remind you, given the right circumstances, wolves can coexist with people in Europe when people are at a density of 3,000 per square kilometre. Wolves can live alongside us when there are 3,000 of us per square kilometre. Most of the white-tailed eagles in Scotland, this is one of the tag birds in Scotland, the reintroduced birds, live outside nature reserves, and only some of the nest sites are effectively guarded. They're accepted, by and large, not entirely, in the landscape. So, you know, wouldn't it be great to have lynx back in the UK? But we're not going to do it unless people understand what we're trying to do, accept it as being worth doing, and so on and so forth. So the future of landscape level conservation, if we're going to be really ambitious, doesn't just lie, or in some cases even lie, with a step change in more, bigger, better and joined. The science behind it, as important as that is. If we can just reconnect people with landscapes and win hearts and minds, stop people feeling threatened by the idea of having beavers, for heaven's sake, or lynx slightly more scary, then we're going to have to do that if we're really going to achieve more, bigger, better and joined at the kind of scale we want to do. It isn't going to be easy. It'll be difficult, but it will be worth it. And I think we surely have, as a nation, the wit and the wisdom and the willpower to do this, to make space for nature, for the benefits of people and for wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Astonishing, wonderful stuff. We have a few minutes for questions.
Can I go?
So clearly landscape restoration is a long-term project.
Yeah.
Nature improvement areas were given 3 years.
Yeah.
What happens?
The all 12 of the nature improvement areas are now independently viable. They're all still going. They all still exist. There are actually quite a number of others that have been added that got no government funding at all. I mean, I think it's outrageous that the government got the funding for them, but I had no control over that. But I made sure they knew. But they're still there. They've done some terrific things. So I mean, if you just take the Durham Valley Nature Improvement Area, with post-industrial landscape, when they started, I forget the exact numbers. Let's say 3 water voles per kilometre of the Durham River. There are now 300. You know, they've come back. So the Morecambe Bay Nature Improvement Area, a lot of the woodlands that have been coppiced and restored, butterfly populations have recovered, and so they've been pretty. They have been successful. I wouldn't say spectacularly successful, but it was a start. And I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
Well, I guess it's the question of what comes next. What's the model that keeps them sustainable? How does the funding
Well,
work?
that's the $24,000 question, because you've got to have a financially viable model. Now, it's unlikely at the moment that a government in the UK will just give money to nature conservation organisations. Well, they give a bit, but it's not very much. But were we to move to a situation where landowners didn't get paid by basic area payments, but got paid for delivering ecosystem services, that would transform the model, because you'd have money for nature conservation and the benefits of people, and that would make a huge difference. And then rewilding is a different step again. But why would, I mean, rewilding is interesting. Why would the statute, you know, a water utility company join in with the Forestry Commission and the National Trust in Ennerdale to rewild Ennerdale? Well, because it turns out if the water coming out of Ennerdale is substantially cleaner than the water that runs off the hill, it means that Northwest Water don't have to treat it to anything like the extent they do. There in the Peak Valley and in the Coombe grasslands of Devon, all of which have water companies involved, it turns out to be 60 times cheaper to manage the landscape than it is to build a water treatment works. So we've got to start thinking about these things. It's not just for the benefits of wildlife, it's for the benefits of wildlife and people, and there are lots of other win-wins. So I'm pretty optimistic. Once government gets this, nature conservation is not an impediment to development, it's fundamental to it.
So, going back to Ian's point, there's a problem in creating early successional state species grasslands, particularly scrubland, and there's a problem in getting the landowners to commit forever to habitat restoration. So Charlie Burrell's idea is you have sort of pop-up,
Yeah.
so you have sort of, you know, you can grow scrubland for 10 years and get money for that, and then you pile it up and start again. Is that bonkers or is that good?
No, I don't think it is bonkers, Bill. What I'm supposed to have done is repeat the question. And what Bill said was, landowners are very reluctant to commit long term. Though interestingly, and Charlie Burrell's idea was, well, if they're not willing to commit long term, you would just let the land lie fallow for 30 years. You get a pop-up nature reserve. It's happened very quickly at NEP, and then later on, if you've restored the soils and cleaned the water, you go back to farming it again. That's a very interesting idea, and I have no objection to that. But let's put another. So the nation, we decide as a nation to stop a major work of art being exported to the States. Okay? And so the nation chips in, the Treasury will chip in, and so on, to stop it being exported, and it's great, it's back in there. And then 30 years later, the museum says, oh, we'll give it to the Americans. I mean, there'd be outrage. So why do we make a distinction between a picture and nature conservation? I mean, it's daft. Anyway, sorry, Bill, go on.
Being not that familiar with the UK situation, but from looking at it from the outside, it seems to me that the Scottish Highlands have the largest potential for large-scale restoration, landscape restoration.
Yes, they have.
But you haven't mentioned much about the Highlands. Why is that?
I didn't mention much about the Highlands because, well, several reasons. One is I only had an hour. Second, the Making Space for Nature report, the core report, was just England. And so that's where a lot of the figures and the diagrams come from. And actually, Scotland is, the land ownership in Scotland is very different. And thirdly, I mean, Bill, can you remember? I mean, the land ownership in Scotland is bizarre, isn't it? Something like 90% of the land is owned by 9% of the people. I mean, it's roughly like that. And they're big shooting estates. And they don't want, most of them want as many red deer on the estate as possible. The land is denuded. It's a biological desert in many places. So the problems in Scotland, because of the land ownership issues, are really difficult. Except in this visionary landscape, the one that we've got, 600 square kilometres, where there are just 3 landowners, so things are much easier. But there are going to be, if they begin to really bring the deer numbers down, which is what they want to do, that has to be by shooting. It's not with wolves, though much as I'd love it to be wolves, it's not going to be wolves. And then the surrounding landowners, there is going to be tension with the surrounding landowners, because their deer will think, ooh, there's no deer there, and it becomes a sink for deer, removing deer off the hill, so that their wealthy clients who want to shoot a deer have more trouble finding one. So Scotland is complicated, and that's about as much as I know about it.
John, can I just ask one question about this idea of running a competition to select sites?
Yeah.
So there's lots of angst in all the conservation literature about choosing complementary sites and prioritising by and all this kind of thing. And I just wanted to know the sorts of criteria and how you balance the aspiration to protect the best sites for wildlife with the kind of involving people and having sustainability in the long term.
So how do we pick the sites when you're doing it? Well, look, actually, you can make a very erudite ecological career by developing clever algorithms that will tell you how to maximise the number of genera and so on. I think they're a waste of time because you can't acquire those sites. They're not available to acquire. And you can't impose that on people. So the situation is bad, and it's bad in many parts of the world. You'd be better off just randomly picking some sites. I mean, Knepp Estate was just a random piece of West Sussex countryside. And look what happened to it. So if you let nature get on with it and don't get too clever and just let nature get on with it, it comes back in spades. So I wouldn't worry about all those habitat selection algorithms and species selector algorithms. To be blunt, I think they're a waste of time.
Never short of being controversial, our hands are shooting up now. I'm going to take the 3 hands that were up a minute ago. So David, and then you, and then Ross. And then we will wrap up. We can carry on. If John's prepared with a drink in hand to carry on taking questions.
The trouble is with a drink in hand, I can't do this.
All right, we'll hold
Sorry.
David.
I was fascinated, John. I learned a lot. And the bits I learned most about was about Rothschild. And I didn't know all of that, so that was really interesting. But what I couldn't work out was, what was his mandate, as far as I'm aware?
He hadn't one. He was part of the Rothschild banking empire. He was fabulously wealthy, and in those days, if you were fabulously wealthy, you could essentially do what you wanted.
You still can.
Well, but he was visionary. He was fascinated by moths. He was fascinated by insects, and he cared, you know, in the same way that we all care about nature conservation. And he used his money not to acquire fine works of art and so on, but to try and protect nature. And because he was wealthy, he could do it.
In terms of the terrestrial protected area of the UK, I'm just interested where the discrepancy comes from in your 10 to 17% figure. Yes, I realise the Wildlife Trust can be difficult, but the statutory designations and the other 3 big conservation landowners estates are well defined.
Working out how much it's not a problem. It's just nobody's done it.
I have.
Yeah. Well, where have you published it? Where have you published it?
Well, that's...
I mean, so that's why I don't know about it. Okay. Another interesting question, actually, turn it around. Now we've got all this massive, and it really is a huge effort in habitat recreation. This is a really interesting research project. Again, that's an important one, and this is another one. Have we reached a turning point when the amount of habitat being put back into the landscape is more than the habitat we were destroying? I don't know the answer to that, and that's a cracking PhD project.
Ross, last one.
Mandate to cover that.
All right. Carry that on over a drink. Ross.
I'll be very quick and I'll be very local. I wonder if you have any tips for how to get the concept of ecological connectivity over to local planning authorities. I've discovered that when you say connectivity, they immediately think that it's more roads to connect people.
Well, that's interesting because planning guidance is pretty clear in terms of wildlife sites and so on, and it is actually planning policy not to fragment wildlife sites. That's a statutory obligation. If they don't understand it, that they're not doing their job properly. I mean, in York, where I live, the York City Council and the Yorkshire County Council, they're pretty good. They do understand the concept of connectivity, and it's connectivity through habitats, not roads. Well, it's interesting.
They've got you banging on their door every day, John.
On that note, I know there are more hands up. I know there are more of you who'd like to ask questions. As I say, if we get a straw and feed John a drink next door, you're all welcome to join us. Please do. Let me just conclude by apologising to the people of Lancashire. And say,
I've lived in York since 1971.
well, I know, yes. Or at least I now know. But no, thanks to Hilary Benn and Caroline Spelman for doing what they did to you. Let's hope that Michael Gove follows suit. And thank you very much, John. That was really inspiring, fascinating, provocative, and we will all try and follow your leadership. Thank you very much.